Whenever I visit a well known beauty spot or historical landmark, I see people performing. They're not documenting, they're performing, smiling, showing their best profile, getting the most attractive backdrop. This isn't intended as a criticism. It's great to see people enjoying the landscape and making memories. And I'm one of those people. However, being able to film every moment of our lives can give a distorted perspective, like it's always sunny in Scotland, or I'm always happy, or you'll only see me when I'm looking my best. This is where the performance comes in, and our devices add to it by offering numerous enhancements. You could be forgiven for having the impression that everyone is happy and enjoying themselves, eating amazingly healthy food, or achieving enviable athletic feats. And this is where the anxiety comes in. People start to compare themselves to others. We can get caught up in a performance loop. No wonder levels of anxiety are soaring, especially among young people. I would go as far as to say that we have a performance culture. So much of our lives is recorded and publicised, much more than even just a few decades ago. Even conversations on social media can be recorded for posterity. What you say now could have repercussions for your career in 20 years' time. And it goes further than this. We're also expected to achieve in school and in the workplace. Even with continuous assessment, the focus is ultimately on results and outcomes. And those results and outcomes can determine our life's path, our destiny. This has always been the case to a certain extent, but it's become much more intense in recent years. In fact, performance culture is a recognised motivational business and organisational philosophy. This is usually described with lots of feel-good buzzwords, but the bottom line is productivity, outcome goals. All this can be exciting, at least on the surface. It might make employees feel as if they're working as a team on a great project. But when achievement, accountability and performance metrics are given top priority, there can be enormous individual pressure to perform, to monitor your achievement levels and to measure up. And that can play into feelings of not being good enough, even when you're trying your very best. In this kind of culture, individual performance can become so important that the employee starts to subconsciously build their identity around their performance. This can trigger enormous anxiety, especially if their performance starts to fall for whatever reason, maybe due to illness or insomnia or family issues. And even when their performance doesn't decline, they might feel that they're not achieving enough, or they might compare themselves negatively with other employees. Anyone who has perfectionist tendencies can suffer in this kind of environment. These days, there's no such thing as a job for life. Working people are often made to feel dispensable. There's always someone waiting to fill your shoes. In times gone by, there was more emphasis on craftsmanship and excellence that came from doing a trade or a profession for years, learning to love it and excel at it. You would really get to know your craft, and you'd probably be expected to make mistakes along the way. You could learn from your mistakes, and you could afford to do so, because with skills built up over time, your job couldn't easily be handed over to someone else. Today, we have a throwaway society where price and profit is all important. And employees are often made to feel that they are as disposable as the goods they produce. But given that we have this performance culture and that many of us earn our living from it, and that seeps into our personal lives, our leisure time, often driving us into competition with others, This is not going away anytime soon. So how do we cope with it? One way is to adopt an attitude of what I call intentional humility. I call it intentional humility to distinguish it from the idea of meekness, unworthiness, or even saintliness. Intentional humility is absolutely not about being submissive. When someone else expects or demands humility from you, that is likely an abuse of the concept. When one person judges another for not being humble enough or tries to humiliate someone, that is an abuse of the concept. But when you make the choice to express humility out of your own volition, it's likely to come from a position of inner strength, inner security, and this can be very empowering. As the American author Simon Sinek discussed in a recent interview.
I think humility, and let's define humility. My favorite definition of humility is by a guy named Bob Gaylor, who was the 5th Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, who just recently died. But Bob Gaylor said, "Don't confuse humility for meekness." He said humility is being open to the ideas of others. And so it's not the aw shucks. You can have a big ego and fool yourself and think you're awesome, but if somebody says, I have an idea, it's the humble one that says, let's hear it. Mm-hmm. Or who actually thinks other people's ideas actually have merit.
Intentional humility is about letting go, dropping the struggle with rivalry and competitiveness. This doesn't mean you should try to stop being competitive, but rather to avoid being driven by competitiveness, so that you don't obsess over results and outcomes. They become less of a priority. It means you can still be inspired by others, but at the same time, you have a realistic view of your own abilities, and you become accepting of your own flaws and mistakes. In fact, you see them as learning opportunities. Intentional humility is about generosity of spirit, about objectivity and balance. The word humility is derived from the Latin word humus, meaning earth. This can be interpreted as being low or being grounded. And being grounded can give you a more realistic perspective. Recent scientific research suggests that humility may directly correlate with realistic self-appraisal, security of personal identity, ability to learn, improved well-being, and resilience to negative life events. According to research from the University of Beijing, humble individuals have a more accurate view of the self. They examine themselves within the context of a larger world, the paper continues, perceiving themselves as part of the whole and recognising their own limitations. This leads to two main outcomes. On one hand, they are able to overcome self-enhancement biases and have a more accurate self-assessment of their abilities and achievements. On the other hand, they also exhibit a more open self-view, acknowledging and accepting their shortcomings and demonstrating greater openness and responsiveness to negative self-information. Intentional humility allows you to adopt a more realistic and more flexible perspective. If you can calmly accept that you might be average, or even below average, you're more likely to learn, to make changes and progress. If you can accept your flaws and mistakes, you can work on improvement. But if you always expect high standards of yourself and nothing else will do, you might find yourself making excuses, avoiding the issue, or even beating yourself up and running away. Removing that pressure to do well, to excel, can actually bring a kind of freedom. When you're comparing yourself to someone else, you're judging yourself according to their qualities. If you're obsessing over your performance on a chart, then you're seeing yourself as a statistic. But if you adopt an attitude of intentional humility, you could just become really excellent at being you, because you have special qualities. Every single one of us does. And when we constantly compare ourselves to others, our own special gifts are put in the shade. It's by finding and nurturing your own special qualities that you can really shine. This is not always an easy thing to do, because most of us are taught to crave success and to be competitive from the moment we start to walk. But by learning to adopt an outlook of intentional humility, that can be the first step towards being comfortable with imperfection, starting to let ourselves off the hook for our flaws and errors, and instead seeing them as opportunities to learn and grow. It's not easy, but once you start doing this, it can bring such relief. Relief from always having to be right or always having to do well. If you have strong perfectionist tendencies or a loud inner critic, you might start chastising yourself for not being humble enough. So it's important to remember that this is not a quick fix or an overnight solution. It's a long process of learning to let go, which never really ends or completes. But each step of that process can bring rewards, a feeling of relief or understanding and new learnings. As we learn to become more comfortable with humility, our perspective becomes more realistic, more flexible, and self-deception starts to fall away. As an example, imagine that you take up running and friends and family keep telling you what a fast runner you are. Eventually, you join a running club, but you find that you're just average. How do you cope with that? If you have a distorted view of your ability, you might make huge efforts to keep up with the fastest runners in the club and end up feeling nauseous and ill, likely with poor times, because you end up hitting a wall. Or on the other hand, you might start chastising yourself, saying, I'm such a slow runner, even though there are many runners in the club who are slower than you are. And how might that make them feel? Someone who has flexible self-perspective and who allows themselves to have real humility would accept that they're not quite as fast as their friends and family enthusiastically suggested. And they might think, this club has some excellent runners. Hopefully they can help me improve my speeds. In fact, one of the key findings of scientific research into humility is that it can actually help us learn. Imagine that 3 students write an essay and they all receive a B+. On each essay, the tutor comments that it shows a high standard of work, but with one flaw that could have been improved. One student reacts by saying the tutor has never liked them and always wants to put them down. Another student chastises himself for overlooking the flaw and spirals into feelings of not being good enough and never being able to do anything very well. The third student feels pleased to have got such a high mark and gets to work on improving the flaw that the tutor mentioned. Of course, it's the third student who's most likely to make the most progress. And that attitude comes from a position of inner strength, from the ability to look at the situation dispassionately and to see it as a learning experience. Choosing to have humility can give clarity, to be able to pinpoint that's where my weakness lies, so this is how I need to improve. It seems simple, really. But so often our emotions get in the way, so that we can't bear to admit that we've made a mistake or that we've been less than perfect. These feelings can actually go back a long way. Maybe as a child we were made to feel ashamed for making small mistakes, or for making mistakes that we didn't even understand were mistakes. Or it could even be that we were over-congratulated for getting things right. And at a subconscious level, we began to link success and achievement with acceptance, belonging, and even love. Sometimes self-compassion can help in these situations. You were driving and someone peeped their horn at you. Often the reaction is immediate anger. But maybe you did come out of a junction too quickly or drifted into the wrong lane. If something like that happens, some unintentional error in any context that leads to angry gestures or words, and you notice that it actually was your fault, just notice the emotions that arise. It might be anger, it might be embarrassment or shame. Whatever it is, it's likely to be uncomfortable. So take a few gentle breaths and say to yourself, I'm human and I don't always get it right, but I'm trying my best and I'll just keep on trying. Try to give yourself a bit of love and understanding. Remember that we're all making mistakes on this planet, and that if you were perfect, you'd probably be unbearable. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more like this.